They were betting on how long it would take before they found him frozen. Not because he was reckless, not because he was unprepared, but because Lars Eriksson had done something no one on the Montana frontier believed could work. While every other cabin in the valley burned firewood through the night just to stay alive, Lars had routed his stove into a bed of stone beneath his floor. And then, on the first night of a brutal winter storm, he let the fire go out. No flames, no glowing iron, no blankets piled on his bed. Outside, the temperature would fall to nearly 40 below zero. Inside, Lars slept in his wool undershirt, warm enough that he woke only once. Not from cold, but from the strange feeling that his cabin was still comfortable when it had no right to be. 6 miles north of the Teton River, in a small settlement west of Fort Benton, his neighbors were fighting for their lives that same night. Men woke every hour to feed stoves. Water buckets froze solid if they were left too far from the fire. Frost crawled across the inside of cabin walls like white fur. And yet, in a cabin sitting exposed on a windy rise with no trees to break the gale, a Swedish immigrant was trusting 4 tons of rock to do what burning would usually did. They had laughed when they saw him building it. That autumn, while others were stacking firewood and sealing drafty walls, Lars spent 6 weeks hauling stones from the creek bed, round granite boulders, some as large as a man's head, packing them into a 3-foot-deep frame beneath his cabin floor. Then he ran iron stovepipes through the rock before venting the smoke outside. At Morrison's trading post, men shook their heads and made jokes. "Eriksson's gone simple," they said, "playing with rocks when winter's coming." They placed bets on whether he'd last until Christmas. What they didn't understand, what no one on that frontier had ever tried before, was that Lars wasn't trying to burn hotter. He was trying to store heat. And when the blizzard finally arrived in November of 1867, it would prove whether he was a genius or whether they were right to expect a body in the snow. The winter of 1867 came early to the Montana Territory. By the first week of November, temperatures in the valleys west of Fort Benton had already dropped to 15 below zero, and the old-timers who gathered at Morrison's trading post spoke in worried whispers about what that meant for the months ahead. They knew the signs. When the cold came that early, that hard, it meant a winter that would test every man, woman, and child who'd chosen to make a life in that unforgiving country. And in a rough-hewn cabin 6 miles north of the Teton River, a Swedish immigrant named Lars Eriksson was about to make a decision that would change frontier survival forever. Lars had arrived in Montana 3 years earlier with nothing but an axe, a rifle, and the kind of stubborn determination that defined the men who pushed west into territories where comfort was a luxury and mistakes were often fatal. He'd spent his first winter huddled next to a cast-iron stove, feeding it logs every 2 hours through the night, waking in a cabin so cold he could see his breath despite the fire burning just feet away. He'd watched his water bucket freeze solid by morning. He'd felt the cold creep through the gaps in his log walls like invisible fingers searching for warmth to steal. And he'd known, with the certainty of a man who'd nearly died from it, that there had to be a better way. Everyone on the frontier knew how you survived winter. You built your cabin tight. You chinked every gap with moss and mud. You kept your stove burning hot and your woodpile high. You slept under every blanket you owned and woke throughout the night to feed the fire, because if you didn't, you'd freeze before dawn. It was the way things had always been done, the accumulated wisdom of generations who'd survived by following the rules that worked. No one questioned it. No one thought to change it. Until Lars did. His neighbors thought he'd lost his mind when they saw what he was building that autumn. While they stacked firewood and prepared for the traditional winter siege, Lars spent 6 weeks hauling river stones up from the creek bed, each one carefully selected for size and shape. Round granite boulders, some as large as a man's head, others the size of winter squash. He built a wooden frame beneath his cabin floor, 3 feet deep and running the entire length of his 18 by 24-foot home. Into this frame he packed those stones, layer after careful layer, creating a bed of rock that weighed nearly 4 tons. Then he did something that made his neighbors openly laugh. He connected his stove to this stone bed with a series of metal pipes that snaked down through the floor, routing the smoke and heat through the rock mass before venting outside. Eriksson's gone simple, they said at Morrison's trading post, spending his time playing with rocks when he should be splitting firewood. They shook their heads and placed bets on how many days into December he'd last before abandoning his foolish experiment and heating his cabin like a sensible man. Some thought he'd freeze by Christmas. Others gave him until the first real cold snap. None of them understood what Lars understood, a principle he'd learned not from books, but from watching the way heat moved through stone in the old country, in the bread ovens and masonry heaters his grandfather had built back in Sweden. Lars knew that cast iron, for all its ability to burn hot, held heat poorly. The moment you stopped feeding it wood, it cooled. Within an hour, it was merely warm. Within 2, it was cold. But stone, dense and patient stone, absorbed heat slowly and released it even slower. Stone remembered fire. And if you could teach stone to hold enough heat, to drink it hour after hour, day after day, you could create something the frontier had never seen. A home that stayed warm through the night without a single log added to the fire. His cabin stood alone on a rise overlooking the Teton River Valley, surrounded by pine forest and exposed to winds that came screaming down from the Rocky Mountain front. It was a location other settlers had avoided, too open, too vulnerable. But Lars had chosen it deliberately. He wanted no windbreak, no natural protection. Because when his method worked, and he believed with absolute certainty that it would, he wanted there to be no doubt, no alternative explanation for why his cabin stayed warm while others froze. The work had been brutal. Each stone had to be carried up from the creek, a half-mile journey that Lars made hundreds of times. His hands blistered, then calloused, then blistered again beneath the calluses. He'd built the frame from cottonwood logs, notching and fitting them together to create a foundation that could bear the immense weight of all that rock. The stones themselves he'd arranged with the precision of a craftsman, largest on the bottom, smaller ones filling the gaps, creating maximum surface area for heat transfer. Between the layers he'd added sand hauled from a gravel bar 3 miles distant, filling the tiny spaces to ensure heat couldn't escape without first passing through stone. The pipe system had been the greatest challenge. Lars had salvaged a 6-inch iron pipe from an abandoned mining operation 40 miles to the south, making the journey twice with a borrowed wagon. He'd bent and fitted these pipes to create a serpentine path through his stone bed, ensuring the hot exhaust from his stove would travel at least 30 feet through the rock mass before venting outside. He also built in clean-out ports at several points along the pipe run, knowing creosote buildup could choke the draft or cause dangerous smoke backup if it wasn't regularly cleared. At 4 key points he'd installed clean-out ports, knowing that creosote buildup would be inevitable and access essential. The work required precision he'd learned as a ship's carpenter in his youth, measuring angles and calculating flow rates with nothing but intuition and experience. By late October, when the first serious snow dusted the valley, Lars had completed his system. The stone bed lay beneath his plank floor, invisible to anyone who didn't know it was there. The stove sat in its usual place near the cabin's center, looking perfectly ordinary except for the pipe that dove through the floor instead of rising through the roof. A second pipe, the exhaust vent, emerged from the ground outside his north wall, a detail that made visitors scratch their heads in confusion. "Where's your chimney, Eriksson?" they'd ask. He'd just smile and tell them to wait. The test he'd been anticipating, the validation he'd worked toward, arrived on November 12, 1867. A blizzard swept down from Canada with a fury that caught even the old-timers off guard. Temperatures plummeted to 38 below zero. Wind gusts reached 70 miles per hour, strong enough to topple poorly built structures and drive snow through the smallest gaps in even well-chinked walls. It was the kind of storm that killed livestock and people with equal indifference, the kind that made men understand just how small and fragile they were against the raw power of a Montana winter. Lars had been firing his stove steadily for 3 weeks before the blizzard hit, letting his stone bed drink in the heat, building the thermal mass that would prove his theory correct or prove him a fool. Each day he'd burned a modest fire, nothing intense, just enough to keep the exhaust gases hot as they wound through his rock labyrinth. He calculated, based on the thermal properties he believed stone possessed, that it would take roughly 2 weeks of consistent heating to bring his 4 tons of granite up to temperature. After that, the stone would become a battery, storing heat energy and releasing it slowly, steadily, hour after hour. His neighbors, meanwhile, prepared the conventional way. They stacked firewood inside their cabins, enough to last 3 days without venturing into the storm. They hung blankets over windows to add insulation. They moved their beds as close to their stoves as safety allowed. They filled every pot and bucket with water before the storm hit, knowing their wells would be inaccessible beneath snowdrifts. They prepared for a siege, for sleepless nights, tending fires, for the exhausting cycle of staying warm enough to survive. When the storm hit, Lars did something that would have seemed insane to anyone watching. He let his fire go out. He'd burned a strong fire through the morning, heating his stove until the iron glowed dull red and the pipes leading down into his stone bed thrummed with escaping heat. Then, at noon on that first day of the blizzard, with wind already screaming around his cabin's corners and temperature dropping by the hour, he let the fire die to coals, then to ash, then to nothing. He cleaned out the firebox completely, and he waited. What Lars understood, what his neighbors could not have known without seeing it, was that his stone bed had absorbed an enormous amount of thermal energy over those 3 weeks of patient heating. Those 4 tons of granite, heated to an average temperature of approximately 190 degrees, contained enough stored heat to warm his cabin for days. The stone was now doing what stone does best, remembering the fire, holding on to that heat with the stubborn persistence of ancient rock, releasing it gradually through radiation and conduction up through his plank floor. Within an hour of the fire going out, a neighbor's cabin would have started cooling noticeably. Within 3 hours, it would be uncomfortably cold. Within 6, dangerously so. But Lars's cabin, warmed from below by 4 tons of heat-saturated stone, maintained a temperature of 64 degrees. Not from any fire, not from burning wood, from rock that remembered what fire had taught it. The physics involved were elegant in their simplicity. Stone has a high specific heat capacity, meaning it requires substantial energy to raise its temperature, but once heated, it releases that energy very slowly. Granite, the stone Lars had chosen, has a specific heat of approximately 0.2 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit. His 4-ton stone bed, 8,000 pounds of granite, heated to an average of 190 degrees in a cabin targeting 65 degrees, represented a temperature differential of 125 degrees. The mathematical calculation revealed an astonishing truth. His stone bed held approximately 200,000 BTUs of usable heat energy. For context, a cord of firewood contains roughly 20 million BTUs, but burned in a conventional stove, only 15 to 30% of that energy actually heats the home. The rest escapes up the chimney as waste heat. Lars's system captured that waste, stored it in stone, and released it with nearly 90% efficiency. But numbers, however impressive, meant nothing compared to lived experience. And as that first night of the blizzard descended and temperatures outside dropped to 40 below, the real test began. In cabins across the valley, families huddled close to their stoves. Men woke every hour to feed fires. Children slept in coats and under piles of blankets. Water left too far from the stove froze solid. The thin line between warmth and death was measured in logs and vigilance. Lars slept in his wool undershirt, on top of his blankets, in a cabin with no fire burning. He woke once during that endless night, not from cold, but from the unfamiliar sensation of being genuinely comfortable in a Montana winter. He placed his hand flat on the floor and felt warmth radiating up from the stone below. Not intense heat, nothing uncomfortable, just steady, reliable warmth that had nowhere to go but up into his living space. The cabin temperature had dropped slightly, to 62 degrees, but it would drop no further. The stone had found its equilibrium, releasing heat at exactly the rate needed to maintain that temperature despite the savage cold raging outside. The blizzard lasted 4 days. By the second morning, neighbors began to worry. Everyone knew Eriksson didn't have the woodpile the winter required. They'd seen his modest stack, enough for regular use, but nowhere near sufficient for a storm like this. Some of the more charitable men discussed mounting a rescue, bringing him firewood and hot food, assuming he must be in desperate condition. But the storm made movement impossible. They could only wait and hope the strange Swede had somehow survived his own foolishness. Lars spent those 4 days in comfort that bordered on the surreal. He maintained a small fire for cooking, nothing more, burning perhaps 3 logs a day compared to the 30 or 40 his neighbors were consuming. The heat from even this minimal fire trickled down into his stone bed, partially replenishing what radiated up through the floor. He discovered that just 2 hours of modest fire each day was sufficient to maintain his 62-degree temperature indefinitely. The stone had become a thermal flywheel, smoothing out the peaks and valleys of heating, absorbing excess when the fire burned and releasing it steadily when the fire went cold. He cooked his meals, read by lamplight, and slept soundly while his neighbors fought exhaustion from tending their fires through endless nights. He used approximately 1/10 the firewood they did. He faced none of the danger of fire while sleeping, no risk of a log rolling out of the firebox onto a wooden floor. His indoor air quality was remarkably better, as he wasn't constantly filling his cabin with smoke from opening and stoking a stove. He'd created something the frontier desperately needed but didn't know was possible: a truly efficient home heating system using nothing more than stone, iron pipe, and an understanding of how heat moves through mass. The science behind Lars's success lay in several interconnected principles that he'd intuited rather than formally studied. First was thermal mass, the concept that dense materials can store large amounts of heat energy. His 4 tons of stone provided massive thermal inertia, resisting rapid temperature changes in either direction. Second was the principle of radiant floor heating, which would not be widely understood for another century. Heat rising from below creates a more even, comfortable warmth than heat radiating from a single-point source. The warmest air in Lars's cabin was at floor level, gradually cooling as it rose, the opposite of a conventional cabin where heat collected uselessly at the ceiling while cold settled at floor level. Third was the efficiency gained from capturing exhaust heat. In a conventional setup, a stove might be 300 degrees, but the exhaust venting up the chimney could be 500 degrees or higher. All that energy, perhaps 60 to 70% of the fire's total heat, simply escaped into the atmosphere. Lars's serpentine pipe path forced that exhaust to surrender its heat to stone before exiting the cabin. By the time the smoke emerged from his external vent, it was barely warmer than the outside air. He'd extracted nearly every available BTU from his wood, storing it in stone rather than throwing it away to the sky. Fourth was the benefit of slow, even heat release. Stone doesn't create hot and cold cycles the way a stove does. It provides constant, gentle warmth that the human body finds more comfortable than the intense radiant heat of cast iron. Lars never experienced the common frontier complaint of being roasted on one side and frozen on the other, never dealt with the thermal shock of moving from beside the stove to a distant corner of the cabin. His entire floor became the heating element, warming the space from below with democratic evenness. When the storm finally broke on the 5th day, and men began digging out from snowdrifts that reached the eaves of cabins, the first priority was checking on neighbors. A group of 3 men, including Thomas Morrison from the trading post and 2 brothers named Dietrich who owned the nearest ranch, fought through waist-deep snow to reach Lars's cabin. They expected to find him in poor condition, possibly dangerously cold, maybe even dead. What they found instead changed everything they thought they knew about surviving a Montana winter. Lars opened his door in his shirt sleeves. Behind him, his cabin was comfortably warm, warm enough that condensation had formed on the inside of his windows. His stove was cold, no fire burning, no smoke rising from the external vent they could now see emerging from the snow. The visiting men stood in the doorway, snow crusted on their heavy coats and ice in their beards, staring in confusion at a scene that made no sense according to everything they knew about winter survival. "How are you not frozen solid?" Morrison asked, his voice edged with suspicion, as if Lars might be performing some kind of trick. Lars smiled and invited them inside. He showed them the stone bed beneath the floor, lifting a plank to reveal the rocks below. He explained the pipe system, the weeks of heating, the thermal mass principle. He placed their hands on the floor so they could feel the warmth radiating up from stone that remembered fire from days ago. He showed them his wood pile, still half full, while he knew theirs were severely depleted. And he told them something that would echo across the territory for years to come. "I burn 1 cord of wood each winter," he said. "How many do you burn?" The men looked at each other. Morrison burned 6 cords. The Dietrich brothers burned 7. Other families burned as many as 10, depending on cabin size and family size. The arithmetic was devastating and undeniable. Lars had created a system that provided superior comfort while using 1/6 to 1/10 the resources. In a region where firewood meant survival and gathering it meant dangerous, exhausting work, this represented nothing less than a revolution. Word spread faster than fire through dry grass. Within a week, every settler within 50 miles had heard about the Swedish immigrant who heated his cabin with rocks. The initial reaction was skepticism. It sounded too good to be true, like the tall tales drifters told to pass time in saloons. But curiosity overcame doubt, and visitors began making the journey to Lars's cabin to see for themselves. He welcomed them all, explained the system patiently to each group, and offered to help anyone who wanted to build their own. The first converts were the Dietrich brothers. They understood the economics immediately. 7 cords of firewood required approximately 40 days of hard labor to cut, split, and stack. Reducing that to 1 cord would free up time for other work, other pursuits. More importantly, in a hard winter when game was scarce and livestock needed constant care, not having to worry about fire tending through the night could mean the difference between animals surviving or dying. They began construction immediately, even though winter still held the territory in its grip, knowing they'd have to wait until next autumn to benefit, but unwilling to face another winter the old way. Others followed. By the spring of 1868, 7 cabins in the valley were being retrofitted with stone beds. By autumn of that year, 23, new settlers arriving in Montana specifically sought out Lars for advice before building their homes, incorporating the stone bed design from the beginning rather than adding it later. The technique spread beyond the Teton River Valley, carried by travelers and traders who'd seen it work. By 1870, some version of Lars's system was being used across Montana, into Idaho, and south through Wyoming. The modifications and improvements came quickly as more people experimented with the concept. Some builders used sandstone instead of granite, finding it held heat even better due to its higher iron content. Others incorporated clay tiles salvaged from abandoned structures, creating more uniform heat transfer surfaces. A blacksmith in Helena developed a standardized pipe manifold that made installation easier. A carpenter in Virginia City created a floor design with removable panels for easier access to the stone bed for maintenance. The basic principle remained Lars's, but the community of builders refined and enhanced it with each new installation. Not everyone succeeded on the first attempt. The system required careful planning and attention to detail that some settlers lacked. Stones had to be properly sized and arranged for even heat distribution. Pipes had to be installed with the correct slope to prevent creosote accumulation. The ratio of stone mass to cabin volume had to be calculated correctly, as too little stone wouldn't store enough heat, and too much would take unreasonably long to bring up to temperature. Failures were instructive, each one teaching the growing community of stone bed builders what to avoid. One of the most common early mistakes was inadequate stone bed depth. Settlers trying to save labor would build beds only 18 inches deep, using perhaps 1.5 tons of stone instead of Lars's 4 tons. These systems worked, but only marginally better than conventional stoves. They'd stay warm for a few hours after the fire went out instead of days. The lesson was clear. Thermal mass was everything, and there was no shortcut to hauling sufficient stone. Another frequent error was improper pipe routing. Some builders ran their exhaust pipes too directly through the stone bed, allowing hot gases to escape before surrendering their heat. Others made the path too long and complex, creating so much resistance that smoke backed up into the cabin. The ideal design emerged through trial and error. Approximately 30 to 40 feet of pipe length, with no single straight run longer than 8 feet, arranged in a pattern that maximized stone contact while maintaining adequate draft. The question of stone selection proved more nuanced than Lars had initially understood. Granite worked excellently, as did sandstone and limestone. But some stones, particularly those pulled from creek beds, contained trapped water that would explosively turn to steam when heated, sometimes cracking the stone or even causing it to shatter. The solution was either selecting only completely dry stones or deliberately heating creek stones slowly over several weeks to drive out moisture before incorporating them into the bed at full temperature. By 1872, 5 years after Lars's first winter success, the stone bed heating system had become standard practice in many parts of the Montana Territory. A man named William Hoffman, who ran a sawmill near Great Falls, estimated that the technique had collectively saved frontier families over 3,000 cords of firewood that year alone. At an average of 40 days of labor per cord, that represented over 300 years of human work not spent cutting and splitting wood, time redirected to building better homes, improving farms, caring for families, and surviving in comfort rather than merely surviving. The safety benefits proved as significant as the resource savings. In a conventional cabin, fire danger was constant and acute. Stoves burned hot, often red hot, and a stray spark or carelessly placed log could ignite a cabin in minutes. Children were burned reaching too close to scorching iron. Exhausted parents, waking to tend fires in the dark, sometimes knocked over lanterns or kicked coals onto wooden floors. Smoke inhalation was a chronic problem in poorly ventilated cabins, especially during the coldest weather when opening windows was impossible. Lars's system eliminated most of these hazards. The stove could be allowed to go completely cold. The floor provided gentle warmth that couldn't burn even if touched directly, and indoor air quality improved dramatically with far less wood being burned inside the living space. The technique even changed settlement patterns. Previously, homesteaders had needed to locate near substantial timber for firewood access. A family might burn 6 to 10 cords per winter, and hauling that would more than a few miles was impractical. This restricted where people could settle, concentrating them in forested areas and near river bottoms where cottonwood grew. The stone bed system, requiring only 1 cord annually, freed settlers to homestead in more open country, on prairie grasslands with distant views and better soil, hauling their modest winter wood supply from miles away without prohibitive labor costs. The Montana landscape itself began to change as cabins appeared in places previously considered too remote from fuel sources. Lars never sought to profit from his invention, though he could have. Patent systems existed even on the frontier, and a technique this revolutionary would have earned him royalties from every installation. But that wasn't the Swedish immigrant's nature. He'd come to Montana to make a life, not a fortune. He helped neighbors freely, spent countless hours explaining the principles to anyone who asked, and personally assisted with dozens of installations. His payment came in the form of community respect and the satisfaction of knowing his contribution was saving lives. Because it did save lives. That fact became undeniable during the winter of 1871 to 72, remembered as the starvation winter across the Northern Territories. A drought the previous summer had left hay crops stunted. An early autumn frost killed what little vegetation had grown. Then the winter arrived with unprecedented ferocity, temperatures dropping to 50 below and staying there for weeks. The game disappeared into deep wilderness. Travel became impossible. Families trapped in their cabins faced a brutal calculus: stay warm or have enough food, because firewood gathering required energy expenditure they couldn't afford. Cabins with stone bed systems weathered that terrible winter far better than those without. The reduced firewood requirement meant men didn't need to exhaust themselves with constant wood gathering. They could stay inside, conserve energy, survive on reduced rations without the additional caloric demand of fighting cold and hauling wood. No one kept exact statistics, but anecdotal evidence suggested that cabins with Lars's heating system saw significantly lower mortality rates that winter. Some estimates placed the number of lives saved at over 100 across the territory. Lars himself helped 3 families survive that winter by sharing his own modest food stores, made possible because his efficient heating system had freed him to hunt more in autumn rather than preparing massive wood stores. He loaded a sled with venison, pemmican, and dried berries and made the dangerous journey to neighbors he knew were struggling. 2 of those families had young children who almost certainly would not have survived without that help. They never forgot. Neither did the community. By 1875, the stone bed heating system had spread beyond Montana. Settlers in the Dakota Territories, Wyoming, Colorado, and even parts of Nebraska and Kansas were building variations of Lars's design. A manual describing the technique was published by a printer in Bozeman, complete with diagrams and specifications. The pamphlet sold for 10 cents and became one of the most widely distributed pieces of frontier literature, second only to agricultural guides and the Bible. Copies made their way east, where engineers and architects began incorporating similar principles into more sophisticated designs. The irony was not lost on those who'd laughed at Lars in the autumn of 1867. Morrison, the trading post owner who'd taken bets on how quickly the Swede would fail, became one of the technique's most vocal advocates, recommending it to every newcomer who passed through his establishment. The Dietrich brothers, early converts, helped install over 40 systems across the territory, training others and spreading the knowledge further. The community that had mocked became the community that championed, because they'd seen proof that sometimes the unconventional approach, the idea that seems crazy, is actually the one that changes everything. Lars continued to refine his system over the years. He experimented with different stone arrangements, testing whether vertical orientation or horizontal stacking provided better heat transfer. He tried various pipe configurations, measuring temperature differentials and heat retention times. He incorporated a water heating coil into his stone bed, providing hot water without additional fuel burning. Each improvement was shared freely, documented in letters to other builders, explained patiently to visitors who still arrived regularly to see the original installation. In 1879, 12 years after his first successful winter, Lars married a widow named Helga who'd arrived from Wisconsin with her 2 children. His warm cabin, she later told friends, had been part of the attraction. She'd spent 2 winters in a conventional cabin and had no desire to repeat the experience of sleeping in coats and waking to frozen water buckets. Lars's home, warm and comfortable with minimal labor required, represented not just survival, but actual quality of life. They lived together in that cabin for another 23 years, raising Helga's children and 2 more of their own in comfort that would have been impossible a generation earlier. The stone bed technique eventually evolved into more sophisticated systems as technology advanced. By the early 1900s, some urban homes were being built with similar principles, but using coal-fired boilers and water-filled pipes for heat distribution. The basic concept Lars had pioneered, thermal mass heating using waste heat capture, became a cornerstone of efficient building design. Modern builders rediscovered his principles in the 1970s during the energy crisis, often unaware they were recreating a technique a Swedish immigrant had perfected a century earlier on the Montana frontier. Lars Eriksson died in 1902 at the age of 73, respected throughout the territory as a man whose contribution had materially improved thousands of lives. His obituary in the Helena Independent noted his innovative heating system and estimated, conservatively, that his technique had collectively saved frontier families over 100,000 cords of firewood during his lifetime. At 40 days of labor per cord, that represented 11,000 years of human work redirected from mere survival to building civilization in an unforgiving land. His cabin still stood as late as 1954, maintained by descendants who recognized its historical significance. The stone bed beneath the floor remained intact, those river rocks still in place nearly 90 years after Lars had carefully positioned them. Eventually, the structure succumbed to time and weather, but not before historians photographed and documented it, preserving the details of a system that had seemed crazy to those who first witnessed it. The story of Lars Eriksson and his stone bed is ultimately a story about innovation born from necessity, about the courage to challenge conventional wisdom, and about the profound impact one person's idea can have when it solves a problem everyone faces. He wasn't a trained engineer or a wealthy inventor. He was an immigrant with an axe and a willingness to think differently about an old problem. He endured mockery, invested weeks of brutal labor in an unproven concept, and risked a Montana winter to test his theory. And when it worked, when his neighbors stopped laughing and started learning, he shared his knowledge freely, understanding that some discoveries are too important to keep locked behind patents and profit. They stopped laughing that winter of 1867, standing in Lars's doorway in their heavy coats, staring at a man comfortable in his shirt sleeves while his stove sat cold and dead. They stopped laughing and started learning. And they never forgot what the Swedish immigrant taught them about survival, about thinking differently, and about how sometimes the craziest idea is actually the best one. The warmth that spread through the Montana territory in the years that followed wasn't just from stone beds heating cabins. It was the warmth of a community that had learned to embrace innovation, to challenge assumptions, and to recognize that wisdom can come from unexpected places if you're willing to listen. Lars Eriksson's legacy wasn't just in the thousands of cords of firewood saved or the hundreds of lives protected from the cold. It was in the lesson that the man everyone calls crazy might just be the one who changes everything.